Hi, I'm Trenton Bennett, and I am the narrator for Robert Williscroft's audiobooks SLINGSHOT and the STARCHILD Compact, and I'm here today to talk with him about his career and also some of the audiobook work that he's done. Hi, Robert. Thanks for joining me.
I'm glad to be talking with you.
So, you've led a really adventurous life. What was it that first inspired you to add writer to your list of accomplishments?
That's really kind of a good question. When I was a teenager living in Germany back in the 1950s, I had stumbled upon science fiction books and fairly quickly came onto the magazines Amazing Story and Astounding Science Fiction, actually Astounding Science Fact and Fiction. I liked that one best because it had solid, hard science fiction stories, and the editor, John W. Campbell Jr., seemed like a cool guy, and he seemed to understand science. And so I wrote my first science fiction story, which was absolutely awful. And I sent it to him, and he didn't ignore me. He sent me back a nice letter and basically told me that, you know, this is really a bad story, but I can see you got some talent and you need to work on it, kid.
Oh, neat.
Anyway, I guess that was my first attempt at writing, and a bit after that, I became somewhat discouraged because I sat down and figured out that at the time, publishers of science fiction were paying about a penny a word, and if you sit down and work out what a typical novel pays, you were lucky if you got $300. And I got to thinking about how long it would take to write a novel and realized that I could be a writer, but I'd better have some other kind of profession because I wasn't going to live off of writing science fiction. Well, the world has changed, and now there are science fiction authors who are multimillionaires, and there's one who could be considered a billionaire. I mean, she is a billionaire, but if Harry Potter is science fiction, which I don't think so, but many do, then the writers have even reached that level.
Yeah, I can see that. That's pretty amazing. You went through a great deal of interesting times from your childhood through your adulthood, but always in the back of your mind, you kind of had the idea, I want to come back to writing if the opportunity presents itself.
Yeah, as a young submarine sailor, first going through sonar school, and to divert momentarily, most people have seen the movie or read the book Hunt for Red October. Jonesy, the black sonar technician who played a prominent role in the movie Hunt for Red October and actually played a similar role in the book. I was Jonesy, except for skin color, I guess. I was precocious and good at my job and in people's faces. And so, back then, I had in my mind that I would write a couple of books. I'd outlined the stories and was working on them so, but I had no training and I had no mentors, and it didn't amount to much, but it kept the spark alive.
Oh, wow. So I know that Operation Ivy Bells, one of my favorite scenes in the beginning is the opening that has a giant squid attack. And it turns out that this scene is actually more fact than fiction. Tell us about your encounter with the Humboldt squid.
Well, the real difference between what takes place in the first chapter of Operation Ivy Bells and what actually happened to me is that I wasn't at 1,000 feet when it took place. The actual incident that inspired the first chapter of Ivy Bells took place off of Baja, California, in an area that was known to be the home of Humboldt squids. The water was quite deep, short. You go just a little bit offshore, and the water drops down to about 1,000 feet. But of course, we weren't diving down that deep because we were just using standard scuba. And we realized very quickly that if you wanted to survive one of these dives, you had to have armored wetsuits. And so we wore sort of a chain metal skin on top of our wetsuits and full face masks. And the story, as it appears in the first chapter, is pretty much what happened, except we didn't have a diving bell and we didn't have somebody bugging us from topside asking us what was going on and so forth.
But you did actually have a squid try and chew on somebody's head. Oh, my goodness.
Oh, yeah. Mine.
Oh, wow. That's just, that boggles my mind, to be honest. It's a great scene, and yet there's so much more that happens through Operation Ivy Bells. It's pretty neat. I really enjoyed that book. So, also, let's talk about some of your science fiction work. Your STARCHILD series borrows from current events, and it extrapolates about a possible future. Has your original vision for that series changed along the way, or do you think things are still lining up pretty much the way you'd expected them to when you started out?
I think they're lining up pretty much as I expected. When the order that the books were written was the STARCHILD Compact and then SLINGSHOT, and the third book, the TAPETUS Federation, I'm still in the middle of writing right now. So I had the broad outline laid out about the idea that we need to get off of our home planet and spread throughout the solar system. The idea that we have a serious menace here on home planet in the radical Muslim community that is worldwide and that has some very strict religious rules that make it very difficult for us to coexist. And with the rise of first Al-Qaeda, and I had been writing about Al-Qaeda and the Muslim menace all the way back in the mid-1980s, with the rise of that, and then the Twin Towers attack, and then ISIS and what it was managing to pull off, I could see and still see a real threat of a global jihad. It looks like the current administration has slowed down the progress somewhat, and it looks like the ISIS leadership has, those that are still alive, has retreated somewhat. But in the long run, it's going to go that way, I believe, probably not under the ISIS leadership, but under the Iranian leadership. And I see a clash of ideas, a clash of civilizations, and ultimately there can only be one outcome. And this is what I have in the back of my mind as I'm putting together this vast saga of future history.
Wow. Yeah. If you think about it, that is truly a global problem. And the STARCHILD Compact, second book in the series, takes on the idea of today's radical Islam by bringing it to a pretty scary extreme. Do you feel like recent events make that idea of a conglomeration rallying around a caliphate seem more likely now, or are you hopeful that reason may ultimately prevail?
Well, if you had stopped the sentence after the word now, I would have said a resounding yes. If you add on to it the question, do I think that reason will ultimately prevail? No, I don't. The radical Islam approach to the universe is without reason, as we define reason in the West and through Western civilization. I'm not trying to say that there isn't reason thought and that there aren't thoughtful people who are Muslim, but the underlying philosophy is one that lacks reason as we understand it. And if we don't come to grips with that as a civilization, if we keep trying to believe that these folks are really just like us, they just have a different religious faith, our civilization is in serious trouble.
It is interesting that in the STARCHILD Compact, you seem to hit the problem from both ends, because on the one hand, you have the caliphate in power, and he's at the very top of the scale. And then Saeed is your bottom rung, who was pulled up from nothing, he was not educated, and probably a lot easier to condition and manipulate.
Yeah, completely. And what happens, and I can give away some of what's going to take place in the TAPETUS Federation, he rises to the pinnacle of Islam. He becomes the new prophet and reestablishes Islam as a single branch with allegiance solely to himself. How he pulls that off, I will let the reader discover when reading the book. But he does it in a way that is logical to both our point of view and their point of view.
That's going to be really exciting to read, I've got to say. I'm looking forward to that one. So, getting back to the STARCHILD Compact, you also hint at events that happen between the creation of the launch loop, which happens in SLINGSHOT, and the ability to cross the solar system with a Vasimir engine. So, do you have any plans to tell us more about these things? Are there any short stories in the works that may go between those two books?
A friend of mine, Alistair Mayer, who is also a science fiction writer, has been encouraging me to do just that. I have not yet done so, but I'm examining several options that bring to the foreground the construction of a couple more launch loops on the Earth and a space elevator on the far side of the moon going to the L2 Lagrangian point. And we have the ability to do that now and the materials to do that now. And I intend on looking at the Vasimer engine, which NASA is in the process of developing now, and examining it from a more short story perspective. Events around the development, the use of it, and when things go wrong, that sort of an approach.
Wow, I simply expected that you might mention colonizing Mars, but that's a lot of rich material I would never have anticipated. That actually sounds pretty exciting.
In fact, we're going to build on the TAPETUS Federation, the Lone Star settlement in Valles Marineris and the New Israel settlement get together and put a launch loop on Mars.
Oh, neat. I guess it's a little bit easier with the lower gravity.
Yeah, they have some improvements too. The launch loop that they build is able to accept capsules and bring them down, not just launch them.
Oh, that's going to be exciting to read, I've got to say. Well, I'd like to digress for a moment and come back to some of your nonfiction work. I recently finished the Chicken Little Agenda and was fascinated about the way that kind of explains things and teaches people critical thinking. If you don't mind, tell me more about the Chicken Little Agenda. What inspired your desire to debunk?
Well, my wife will tell you that I've been a debunker all my life. But that aside, I spent a year at the South Pole doing research. And when I came back, soon after that, I retired to a small town with 2,500 people in eastern Washington state, Dayton, Washington, at the foot of the Blue Mountains. And I was kind of I guess you could say, a big fish in a little fish bowl, because I'd been out there and done lots of exciting things. And people knew who I was, and I had an office and was running a business there. And virtually every day, one of the farmers, these were, for the most part, wealthy farmers, wealthy wheat ranchers. It's the asparagus capital of the world. Anyway, they would come in and tap on my desk with a newspaper and say, "Hey, Robert, look at this. What do you think?" And I would read a headline or an article on a back page somewhere. And the rancher would look at me and he'd say, "I may not be as educated as you, but this doesn't make sense to me. What do you think?" And I'd look at it, and typically I would come back with, "You're absolutely right. It just doesn't make sense. Let me explain how this thing works." And he'd walk out, and a half hour later, "I thought so." And it occurred to me that there were enough people asking those kinds of questions that I could write a column in the local newspaper, and it would be very well received. And so I went and talked to the editor, and it was a small town newspaper. And he said, "That's a great idea. Let's do it." And it caught on and got picked up by every other local newspaper in the Pacific Northwest, so that I was syndicated over a pretty wide area. I called the column the Thrawn Rickle, which is ancient Scottish for a stubborn, loose, dilapidated heap. A friend of mine suggested at some point, "These are pretty good columns. Why don't you put them together into a book?" And so I did, and I linked them together with the Chicken Little theme, which wasn't there at first. It was just the articles without that "the sky is falling" concept. And I found a publisher down in Granton, Louisiana, basically in New Orleans, who published the book. And it did reasonably well. I got lots and lots of radio interviews. I was interviewed by Michael Medved 3 times and was on Fox News and CNBC, and literally dozens and dozens of radio stations across the country and in Canada. And it had a pretty good impact.
It's really a good read, I have to say. You do a good job of explaining things in a way that doesn't really talk down to the listener, and I will admit I'm not super science savvy. I love science, but I'm not as learned in it, if you'll say. So I really kind of like the fact that you give layperson approaches. Do you think that the average person or people in general are getting smarter about critical thinking skills in the wake of the fake news controversies, or do you feel like the glut of information on the internet makes that harder to do?
I belong to the Adventurers Club in Los Angeles. It's a club by invitation, people who live their lives off the beaten path. Most of the members are older fellas and grew up in an era where they learned critical thinking in school, not like young people today. And yet these guys would send me an email and say, look what I found on the internet. Isn't this amazing? And I'd look into it and I'd come back with an email saying, you might want to check this out. Here are the facts surrounding it. So even people with critical thinking ability don't seem very able to distinguish fact from fake when they browse the internet. So in answer to your question, no, I don't think so. I think that people are becoming increasingly ignorant about what's going on and increasingly naive and gullible as to what they're told.
It seems like it is harder to turn the tide when there is so much information to choose from, and so much of it is not as easy to vet, I will say.
One of the problems regarding that really bugs me is that when somebody like myself or someone else comes along with facts, those who don't agree shout them down.
And I guess that's one of the frustrations, is how do you say, here are facts in hand, and someone simply doesn't wish to see those facts? I guess you can't really force them to think or to analyze if they really don't want to.
I often hear the phrase, well, those are your facts, not mine. Think about that.
It's amazing. So much information at our fingertips, and yet we have to wade through so much garbage to find the gold. Well, let me ask you, on the subject of the Chicken Little agenda, are there more acorns for us on the way? Do you see a Chicken Little agenda sequel?
Probably not. The book includes, in one way or another, all of the columns I wrote during that period, and additional material that characterizes my awe for the universe and what it is and how it impacts us, and some of my thoughts about the education system and how government functions. And basically, I've addressed those things. They're timeless. The book was written back in 2006. It was published in 2006, and 11 years later, the material is still completely pertinent and enjoyable. I don't see another one of those coming out, but I do see the IAPETUS Federation, which continues the STARCHILD series, and I see at least one more book in that series about the conquest of Mars, the first trip to Mars and what happens, and I see a sequel to Operation Ivy Bells with a couple of the characters continuing on in the next book that will take place underneath the Arctic ice cap.
Oh, wow. You've got a lot in store then. Honestly, you could take just those two series and go on for quite a long while. It's amazing the fertile ground of ideas in both the real and the fiction. And I guess part of that maybe is because you base a lot of that hard SF in real fact today.
That makes a big difference, yeah. I don't use dragons because dragons, as they're conceived, can't really fly. And while one can come up with swallowing something that causes them to be able to belch fire, that just doesn't quite ring true to me. And so I don't have dragons in my stories, and I don't have fairies in my stories. At least not the kind that appear in the fantasy books out there that masquerade as science fiction.
It's funny you should mention that. I was just thinking the other day about Anne McCaffrey's fun-to-read series about the dragons, Dragonflight, Dragon Quest. That was actually a science fiction series with the idea that the dragons were genetically engineered for a very specific reason. And yet, reading that book, I think, okay, spaceships and science and engineering, but at a certain point, that just doesn't really wash. You have to kind of set that aside and accept that this is entirely a fantasy story.
And yet I agree with you. It was great writing and great stories, and I read them in my late teens and early 20s and thoroughly enjoyed them. My friend Alistair Mayer has written a series that surrounds something he calls T-space. He's developed within the framework of his story, a method for FTL, faster than light travel, and he has his people discover planets around the Alpha Centauri system, and these at least 2 planets that are fine for human life. And what they discover as they spend time there is that these planets have been terraformed in order to support human life a long time ago, maybe 60 million years in the past. And his series, he's got 3 novels in the series now and more to go, and some short stories, and they all are about the concept of the fact that somewhere out there in the distant past, there was somebody or something who thought it was a good idea to terraform a whole bunch of planets for human existence, but they're all gone and the planets are empty. So it's the concepts that you can use with real science and throwing around some plausible concepts are really, there's a lot out there, and all you have to have is somebody who can, 1, write, and 2, understand science and knows how to put the 2 together.
I have to admit, I kind of like to hear that, because I know in the StarChild Compact you introduce a culture of people that has the ability to travel at light speed or very, very, very close to it. And at the same time, I listened to the Chicken Little Agenda audiobook and realized that much as it might be fun to get close to light speed, Einstein tells me I'd probably be flat by the time I get there. It's a little disappointing.
Now, in the Iapetus Federation, the founders who are introduced in StarChild Compact and the StarChild Institute, which is put together by both groups, the founders and Earthlings, they developed something called the Einstein-Rosen Bridge. I will leave it at that, except it opens some fascinating possibilities for how one can get from here to there really, really fast.
That's going to be really fun to read, because if you look at other fiction works, a lot of times when they approach faster than light speed, no pun intended, or light speed itself, they simply say, well, it just is. We figured it out. It's Star Trek. We know how to warp now. And they don't get into the mechanics of it, but it sounds like you're going to try to address some of that a little bit, just like you did in the StarChild Compact.
Yep. We're gonna address it in sufficient plausible detail that a scientifically educated reader can say, hey, that might work. And what was fun about the T-Space series that Alistair put together is that he uses an entirely different approach that, once again, is based on modern physics, and the intelligent reader can say, that's plausible. And that's what's fun about writing hard science fiction, is making something that isn't now, may never be, but is plausible.
And in that lies really the greatest gift that science fiction can give us, is it helps us to imagine, and sometimes we can make that imagination a reality. It inspires the scientific mind. Well, Robert, I really do appreciate your time, and I certainly want to thank you for agreeing to do this interview. I'm excited to see what comes next, and I certainly look forward to talking to you again.
Yeah, me too. I think this went very well.